Hello, everybody, and welcome to our In Conversation webinar, The Future of Film and Journalism. So this is one of a series of In Conversation webinars that we have for the Lancaster Sociology Department's kind of public series. So if you're interested in this, we have another one coming up, I think, on the 22nd of April. This afternoon's discussion is about the future of film and journalism. And in this conversation, Ted Gutsche from our Sociology Department and Maryam Ghorbankarimi from Lancaster Institute for the Contemporary Arts share their perspectives on how, in the context of current challenges and changes, we might think about and shape the future of film and journalism. Maryam is a lecturer in film practice. Her research is on women and Middle Eastern cinema, both in front and behind the camera. She's also a filmmaker and has begun her production company, Bina Film, in collaboration with other creative minds in the northwest of England in 2020, which I imagine was a very intense time to start something like that. Her post-lockdown short film Slots is due for release later on in the year, I think, so keep an eye out for that. Ted is a senior lecturer in critical digital media practice. He's worked to bridge journalism, theatre, science communication and virtual reality studies related to sea level rise. His research is in the field of journalism studies, and he currently produces a podcast about journalism, The J Word, which you can find, I think, on most podcasting platforms. So we will get started. As this is a live webinar, there may be some delays, so please just be aware that it may take a little bit of time for us to get used to this process. Okay, so I will ask the first question to Maryam, just to get us started. So film and journalism have changed radically during COVID. I think we would all kind of agree on this, although please feel free to disagree if you wish to. But particularly as whole industries have become virtual overnight. But in some ways, I think they've also remained a kind of constant for us to navigate the ups and downs of the pandemic. How has COVID changed, in your case, the film industry over the last year or so, would you kind of say?
Okay, well, first of all, hello to everybody, and thanks, Emma, for organizing this. It's wonderful to be next to other colleagues having a conversation about the future of our industries. So yes, I mean, from I think public standpoint, it feels that this was a quick overnight change. But what I think my view of the change is that the changes were coming, and I believe that the pandemic basically just accelerated this change. I would like to kind of break this in two kind of aspects of film, if we like. One, if we think about the distribution side of film and how films come to us, and then the industry, the filmmaking side of it. Of course, the impact of the COVID, pandemic has really impacted the production. And for many months, actually, big production companies kind of went into a halt. But if you really look at it, since last August, bigger companies that had, the money to support themselves and put, the tests that now even at university we have access to, the asymptomatic tests, they put it in place. I'm aware of, big production companies like Disney that reinstated their company productions in August last year and have continued filming. I'm not saying that they have continued making the same type of films that they were planning to make, but they very quickly adopted and changed as they would, which that very quick change, if I put it in short, because I don't want to go on a huge tangent, is that we see more and more insurgence of bringing in visual effects and animations in productions. So there's a lot of live action films that are being filmed in a very minimalist sets, perhaps even on stand stages mostly, thinking that then the background and the locations are going to be kind of matte painted in through the visual effects in the post-production. In fact, if you look at the industry, the post-production side of the industry, which means anything, is not just the editing for people who are not that aware of it, anything from color grading, bringing CGI work into it, animation into it. And when I say animation, I'm not meaning films that we can recognize that they are animations, but in fact, the live action films that are incorporating 70% of the film frame that are animated in a live action form. You can actually see that industry has been quite flourishing. during the pandemic when it comes to post-production. There's many new companies in North America, in the UK, that actually gain more work during this time to adjust for the need of the industry. So the industry has been, in my opinion, very kind of well responding to it when it comes to the bigger picture. When it comes to low budget filmmaking and smaller companies, that's a complete different kind of experience. And as you saw that, like, I mean, I started my company, but that was something that I wanted to do when I moved to Lancaster, and I wanted to work with creative colleagues around me. So that was incoming, and I kind of took a chance and still did it, despite the fact that we were in a halt. And also I did it for the perspective of this, that I'm teaching film practice. I wanted to see how do I face it, and how do I then guide my students do the same thing. So the second thing, I'll try to be very quick, which is the distribution side of it. If we look at it in my perspective, now everybody's talking about Netflix and Amazon and all these streaming platforms that, you know, now we are more aware of them. Those of us who've been following film, I think we were aware of them coming up. And if you do a quick Google search, you can see 2017, 2018, the fight between Cannes Film Festival and Netflix, and the fact that Netflix was banned for kind of having their films released for competition at the festival because they were not released theatrically in France. So these kind of issues were already coming up, and the question of asking that what's the future of film was being asked well before pandemic came. But the pandemic kind of made it that these platforms really then took over. And in short, I can say that cinema and film is a modern technology. If we look at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of kind of avant-garde artists turned to film because it was the new technology. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, cinema and film need to kind of go with the flow of advance of technology. And if this virtualization is the future, so be it. We need to work with it that way. Yeah. And I can say proudly that I have 76 students on one of my modules, short film production, and they are in 9 different countries, and they have produced 15 different films in collaboration together. So it is possible. I'm not saying they're the same caliber of films that they would have done if they were all in Lancaster, but it is possible.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, and thank you for bringing in the student question at the end there as well. So I have quite a few practically focused students also who are managing to make their media and produce despite some of the limitations of COVID, which of course might be much more likely to hit those smaller, more independent kind of productions. Certainly I know, as I'm an Australian, I know that a lot of Hollywood productions have set up there because they basically don't have COVID. And so, you know, that's been interesting for the industry there, but they have simply carried on. So that's quite interesting to observe. And it's so often with these, it'll be interesting in a moment to see what Ted has to say with these big changes that get marked out in industry, that so often they've been on the horizon for a long, long time. And it just appears that way to an untrained eye, that something has suddenly profoundly changed when it hasn't necessarily. Okay, so I'm just going to switch to Ted. I think you should be live now, Ted. Would you like me to go over the question again, or are you happy to go straight on?
I think, well, thanks both of you and everyone for doing this. It's a great opportunity to talk about the future. So yeah, I mean, asking the future is a part of a project I'm working on. I'm part of the Institute for Social Futures here at the university, and one of my initiatives is to work on a book about the future of journalism, usually probably from a critical race perspective. I probably should be working on it now, but I haven't yet. But I think, so there's so many dynamics and dimensions for talking about the future. You know, as we were just saying, the conversation could go on forever. But I think one of the things that was coming down the road that COVID led us to is a similar point that we just left off with, which is working from afar and working off location and working online. And journalists in Western society in particular, but certainly globally, have been watching their newspapers, the news organizations, community radio stations, closing their doors for decades now, but that number is increasing. That's creating massive news deserts of people who aren't getting local and even regional, and then that means sometimes international news about what's going on in the world. And there are kind of two sides to this. One is that, yes, that's absolutely a problem that had started and has been accelerated by COVID. We have major news organizations, particularly in the US, who had spent tens of millions of dollars to build buildings. They were in them for a very short period of time and have realized they don't have the money or they think the need to keep them open. So journalists are working from home. That's not surprising. Most of us are working from home. But the difficulty here is that journalism is such a social product. It's one that requires communication between editors and other reporters to share and bounce off ideas quickly. And that can happen digitally, of course, but it's different than sitting in a room and being able to argue over what the lead is going to be, or how you're going to stack the program or something like that. Now that certainly is being done, and people can still get to each other quickly digitally. But the question here is, there are two questions here. One, is this sustainable? People not working in a space together in something that is so social and so much about breaking news and so much about getting out information accurately in a meaningful way quickly. Is this a sustainable model? Can we use Slack and other things well enough, or Teams or other things well enough to do that? But then the other question is, could this solve our news desert problem? Could people then be able to live outside of particular areas? Will that allow people to go into, there's a place in Miami where I was before I came here, where there's Palm Beach up north, and then there's Miami in the bottom, and in the middle is this town of Hollywood, the city of Hollywood. And no media cover it because the marketplace and the advertisers push north and push south. So there was like nothing going on there. If you're a reporter and you're working up north or up south in that particular area, why can't you just live in Hollywood and cover what's going on there? You don't need to open up a newsroom for that. You can do that from your apartment or from a coffee shop. But another aspect of this is, will journalists do that? We've had decades of research that show journalists tend to be quite socially distant from the people that they cover. They tend to not live in minority, I'm speaking of the US, they tend not to live in large minority communities unless they're a part of that community. They tend to live in the suburbs and not in the urban areas, but yet they cover the urban areas for a suburban audience. So there are lots of issues about geography that could be really positive and helpful for journalists who want to be entrepreneurial, who want to be digital, who want to help, close the gap on those digital or on those news deserts, right? But then there are also questions of, can we break the mold of what journalism has been as that social elite organization and have it be something more grassroots and more dispersed? So I think that those are the great opportunities, but also challenges that journalism is facing. And that was just from a little sliver of what's going on.
It's really interesting to think about. If I imagine remote work in a lot of industries, it's simply, are you in an office, a traditional kind of, white collar office, or are you in, maybe a kind of a specific workplace where you maybe work in a factory, or you do maybe an automotive workshop. But of course, in the creative industries, we need to think about remote work across a whole range of different kind of strata. So we're thinking about things like with journalism, being in a community versus being remote can actually profoundly change the content you make. I think the point that you made, Maryam, about CGI was such an interesting one because, again, to the untrained eye, we don't always notice that so much of film is in the post-production. We imagine that people get on set, you might have an auteur or a director who's there saying, oh, we're going to get this perfect shot. And that's not really how film works. So if you have people almost entirely remotely putting this work together, it's interesting to kind of think about how that does actually change what we see and how we might know about the world. So I think, which is always something that I would say is the benefit of doing things like journalism or film and media studies, is to get this sort of knowledge of that background kind of process as well. So I do want to keep moving. I have some questions that we might come back to that have come from this response, but just to keep kind of covering other ground as well. So this question, Maryam, so you have the film production company that you've started in 2020, so Bina, and you've been working on the co-directed short film slots. And presumably this has been without the usual fanfare of a kind of in-person launch. You know, normally you would want to be sharing that kind of process with people and launching the film once it's finished. So I just wanted to know, you know, what was that experience like making that film and then sort of doing all of the post kind of stuff and you know, preparing to launch the film during COVID and just kind of thinking through that experience. And also I'd love to know a bit more about the film as well.
So as I kind of briefly mentioned it, so this was when I moved to Lancaster in 2018. I've been trying to kind of connect with local artists and other filmmakers and creative people, and so I met my co-director. He's a fantastic writer, but as many of us, the creative side is his kind of not his day job. So Anthony Povo that I work with, so he's working on many scripts, and we've been kind of talking about for a couple of years to make some of these scripts, bring them to life. And this was the first script that I thought, okay, I'm starting my company. It's a small film. It's only like less than 15 minutes, so it won't need a lot of budgets. We can you know put it together ourselves. So the plan was always to make this film in 2020, basically. But then we didn't know that, you know, 2020 will turn to what it turned to. So sometime in the summer when we had, you know, our normal kind of Zoom chats during the first lockdown, we came up with this kind of plan that we knew that they were releasing kind of the lockdown in late August, September. And we thought, let's take advantage of it. And I have to admit, I'm so glad that he was happy with this, because it was around the same time, which I'm sure was the same for Ted and my other colleagues as well, that we were thinking of how are we running our next academic year. And I'm the person who teaches film practice. So in a way, I wanted to kind of give it a try myself before I can put it to my students. And you knew, you know, the new measures that, you know, film production now it's like considered in the UK as production and work, so you can actually be on set, that's fine. Certain measures you need to do to take on. So we tried to do it with minimal crew. So I have 2 actors and the whole film is shot in a car. And there was no way for them, it would have been extremely boring if they had masks on in the car. So what we managed to do with our wonderful actors is that they accepted to kind of self-isolate ahead of time for 10 days before we started filming, that we could put them both in the same car for extra long hours. And it's a very, and because of that, we didn't have a sound designer, we didn't have a sound recordist. It was a super minimalist skeleton crew. It's like a minimal crew. Which you see it now in the production as well. So I know there's a lot of kind of technical issues with the film, which is because of that. But at the same time, I'm happy I did try to make that, to kind of know what are the limits we can push in a kind of independent filmmaking. Because my fear, which I think is everybody's fear, is that the low budget elements, people who have in the past managed to do it as a second job, as their passion job, the weekend thing they do, they won't be able to do it anymore. That's the issue, because they huge companies, they have the extra cash and the padding to kind of create the safe space, if you like, to work in. So from that perspective, it was something that we tried to do, and I'm happy. Yes, it is sad that we couldn't kind of have that kind of local kind of screening of it yet, but we'll hope to have it at some point soon. But it was a good run, and so kind of made me encourage me to be able to ask this of my students as well. And I'm happy to see that they have managed to do it. It's one of, I think I'm a believer that I need to have done something before I can ask someone else to do the same thing. Yeah. So I hope I answered your question. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. That was so interesting, just to think about some of the opportunities that come from such kind of totally unhinged kind of year, right? They're very extreme kind of situation, but at the same time, those creative possibilities. And it is interesting, as educators, we all kind of are teaching students to potentially work in media industries, but to know that these industries, that some of the opportunities can be very difficult to come by. You might for some time be working a job and doing your creative work. To think that we can have innovations where you can make a film despite COVID is actually quite a positive, or hopefully quite a positive development out of something that's otherwise, quite a negative experience for most, if not all of us, in many ways. So that's very interesting to hear about. Thank you for that. So just again to keep us moving along, I have a question for Ted. So Ted, you produce a podcast which is called The J Word in conjunction with the journal Journalism Practice. And you've developed this and recorded this, as far as I can tell, this is during COVID, that this is kind of, I imagine you've probably had it on the burner before then. So what's this experience led you to understand, firstly about practices of journalism, but also again about maybe some of the impacts of COVID and where they kind of take us in that respect?
Well, I completely agree with Maryam's ideas of having to do something before you can ask somebody to do it. So if you listen to the first few episodes, be forgiving. It's something you're doing out of your room with the tech you buy that you can afford and what you're doing. I have to say that was not on my mind before COVID. What was on my mind was how insular academia is and can be. I think one thing that we do in our department and at Lancaster, we could always do better, but what we do is we try to break down some of those myths of what we do. I mean, I think the way we interact with our students, the way that they're involved in the things that we do, including the management of the department and our ideas for what classes should be and all that sort of stuff. I think we're working toward more of an egalitarian sort of workplace and learning space. But so that kind of did feed my idea of, well, how do we get journalism practice scholarship in the hands of journalists and also in the hands of so many parts of the world that corporations don't make it affordable enough to be. Libraries there don't maybe have the money to subscribe. It's also in English, so trying to find money to translate. So I've been trying to think of these different ways of doing this, and again, still we're speaking in English on the podcast, so maybe that didn't solve all of the problems, but it's been a really great experience to try and once again play with sound and play with some software, and more than anything, be a bit subversive in the sense that the guests that come on, some are big name journalism scholars, right? But most and many of them aren't. And most and many of them are from parts of the world that don't necessarily make it onto plenaries and keynotes and get their books published by, the publishers that we might know, but are doing amazing and important work. And so part of this is borrowing from social capital of people who have name recognition, and really, having them on for an episode, but then bringing in these other people who are quite brilliant, to talk about not just journalism in their own geographies, because that would be a bit patronizing, wouldn't it? But to have them, my wife has this really great idea of that probably was somebody else's idea. There's nothing new, right? That we learn about other people, but we don't learn from other people, right? And so this has been that was probably some author everybody else knows who said that, but and so that's what I'm trying to do with the podcast, is borrow and play with these oceans of social capital and build community between these scholars who have cited each other, who know each other, who do AI in global newsrooms and who do VR, who work with journalists in Colombia, who work with journalists under threat in Mexico and other places, and bring them to kind of together into having conversation that's helpful for students, citizens. I mean, I hope it is. And the best part is, for the time when we drop the episode, we're giving, we're getting from the corporation some free access. They're not open access articles, but they're free access for a period of time, right? So we're also trying to play with a bit of capitalism here in letting people letting people access this information for free, which, it's quite expensive to publish in open access. So free access for a month, and you spread that around, that actually might be getting it into people's hands a little bit more. So again, I'm not sure I answered your question fully, Emma, but it is, it's not the best podcast in the world, but its purpose isn't to get, 400,000 listeners. It's a bit to be subversive and a bit to be about relationship building and having really fascinating conversations.
And I think this is something that's particularly interesting about, again, this ties in with what Maryam was saying about opportunities, potential opportunities, at least during COVID. That one thing I've noticed with podcasting as a form, even with students of mine who are making podcasts for their final dissertation, that actually when we may not have thought to interview people a long way away before, suddenly with COVID, those barriers seem just a lot less insurmountable in a way. So you can think, I could, as you say, interview people who are very important and well known in academics of journalism and things like that, but also people who maybe you wouldn't speak to otherwise. And I think, again, this could be something for us to take that's quite positive, and may also, we can only hope, influence the direction of journalism, maybe to be a bit more, as you say, kind of subversive, or maybe we could say democratized, open to more people. I think that's quite interesting. So I've only got a couple of kind of questions left. And before I went on to those, I wanted to see if either of you had a question for the other person. So I do have to switch between everybody's heads because, of course, this is a live event. So behind the scenes, I'm switching between heads. But I think I'll start, just because I've been going backwards and forwards, I'll just start with you, Maryam. Did you have any questions or comments for Ted at this point? I mean, it's fine to say no, and we can come back in a moment because I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here.
No, I think actually I had first wanted to ask a question about how that has impacted teaching students about this, and are you using your podcast in your teaching? But I think you somehow answered it as well, but please, if you can, that would be wonderful.
Well, I encourage people to use the podcast if they want to. I mean, if we're speaking honestly, I think students have, a lot of academics, we've tried and maybe overloaded students during COVID a little bit too much by saying, here are all of these amazing resources, right? And I think that, I think that we still have some learning to do going forward, and hopefully in our lifetimes, we don't have to deal with this sort of thing again, but there will always be something, right? And there'll always be students who aren't on campus. There have been students who aren't on campus for a very long time. They had correspondence courses, decades ago. And before that, you would, go off and study and then go home. I mean, this is, that sort of distance isn't necessarily new. It just feels and looks different. But I think, we still have some learning to do on how to best provide, because our students are very keen to do well and very keen to absorb and very keen to produce and very keen to get it right, which that's not necessarily always the case and what we shouldn't be learning. But and so the more we give them, the more they take, and so it's a balance. But I do think there are times where it is helpful talking about the history and the meanings of clickbait, for instance, and how and why that's still around, and why are reputable, quote unquote, media organizations doing clickbait. That could actually be a clickbait headline. Reputable media companies use clickbait. Here's why, right? So, bringing them into those types of things is just a balance. I think they'll probably be more interested in it once we go back to being in person, because we won't be inundating each other with all the digital resources where if we don't use them, we kind of feel guilty. So I'm holding them in my can because I think that there will be some that are helpful. Can I ask you a question, since it's on me right now?
Yeah, go ahead.
What were these two people doing in a car?
Commuting to work.
Commuting. Can you say more, or because it's under 15 minutes, is that just going to ruin the whole thing for us?
No, it's not meant to be any of those kind. It's not a suspense or anything. It's about two middle-aged men who are commuting to work, and they contemplate. And it's set in the Northwest as well, so they're contemplating to skip work and go instead to Blackpool.
Wow.
So it's a dialogue about people kind of considering the state they are in, which kind of works really well under the COVID year, I think, as well, because I think a lot of us have reconsidered our jobs in general, although we haven't been commuting.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. That's quite interesting as a film, almost as a kind of foil for COVID, right? Like, what is the complete opposite of being stuck in your house, remote working, is being in a car with a colleague and deciding to go to Blackpool, right? Like, that is the absolute antithesis of what we've all been doing. I think there's something really quite poetic to that. Sort of looking forward to, somehow chasing that down at some point and watching it remotely from where I'm located, which isn't right in Lancaster either. So we've progressed quite a lot. We've covered a lot of different topics. I think this has been really interesting. I've got one kind of biggish question left and just a couple of little ones which we may or may not get to. But I think just thinking about students who are watching or might come back and watch this at some point. So you both teach critical and practical approaches to kind of media production. So you're involved in teaching students how to make as well as think about your particular forms. So what would you say to those who are curious of becoming a student of film or media or journalism, or getting into film and journalism right now? And I'll start again with Maryam, and then we'll go to Ted. It's just sort of, what would you say to students who are considering this as not even maybe a career, maybe something they do on the side as well, because that's increasingly common?
Well, one of the main things that I think it might be, this will give up my age more than anything, is that something that I cherished the changes since the year 2000 to 2021 we live in now, is access. So as a student, an undergraduate student in early 2000s, it was finding that kind of special video shop that carried this film or that film, and kind of wait in line to get access for it. It was something that kind of made me feel that students who want to come and study film and media today, they have the wealth of access. And I think the pandemic year has made this access even kind of 5 times more easier when it comes to kind of watching films and finding ways to attend film festivals that we could never do that beforehand. So this is something that I love it. Sitting in Lancaster, I could manage, be elsewhere this past year. There's so many negative things. I miss sitting in a real cinema watching films. But at the same time, due to our jobs that, we are like bound to teaching terms, you miss a lot of these kind of events that when you were a student, you could skip and go do them, go attend them. And I studied in Toronto, and then I studied in Edinburgh, which both house one of the most fabulous, best film festivals in the world. But now having this access, this is something that I would say that instead of, for students who want to come and study film or media in general, I think, please don't just see the negativities of how things have changed, but instead look at what you've gained because of it as well. And from that perspective, I think it's not that bad. But having said that, for example, our film program, we're not a film school, it's a film studies program. So we're teaching students how to creatively and critically look at films and analyze them. And the film practice we do, it's basically helping them understand the kind of the structure and the way films are put together. Of course, students who are quite creative minded and they fall in love with making films might carry on, become filmmakers and video makers, image makers, whatever, moving image makers and artists. But at the same time, the purpose is to understand the language of images and moving pictures. And that's what we're teaching. And I don't think whether it's being remote or not is impacting it. And I've done my best, and I think I'm being a bit too proud of it, because I'm also an external, and I'm communicating with other colleagues across the UK, for example, that a lot of programs like ours that had a small percentage of practice, they decided not to run those modules the past year. But we did, and we modified them to make it work. And I'm proud that we did this, because through this modification, we learn new ways to approach it. So even next year when we're coming back, and it might be everything be back to normal, I'm going to take advantage of what I learned the past year working with my students and offer them a more complex kind of practical module as we traditionally used to do. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I think particularly that I wasn't aware that so many places weren't delivering their practical, because, you know, we did that as well. And in fact, it was very successful, and we got really excellent feedback. And one student said they thought it was actually more productive than doing it in person, just because they were able to focus on the technical kind of aspects of what they were learning. So I think, yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I'll just switch across to Ted as well. So again, it's sort of, you know, what would we say to students who are curious about getting into, and I mean, you know, about practical sort of journalism, not just sort of, well, not as you do as well, Maryam. So both journalism, but also academic kind of study of media as well.
Yeah, I mean, my recommendation is you're probably already doing media. You're probably already doing forms of what could be interpreted as film or art or theater or journalism. And I think it's important to start to build that portfolio early. And to build portfolios, I mean, even of Instagram photos, but do it without the filter, right? Show us what you're learning in your natural, you know, a natural uncropped maybe, or slightly cropped and not manipulated photograph, right? To show the progression of the capturing of the natural use of technology, if that's even a thing. But I think that I once had a student when I was back in the States teaching, and the student was a junior in university, and I said, well, how many good clips do you have? How many pieces of journalism? And the student said 10. And, you know, I'd written for, you know, the Chicago Tribune and Washington Post and these other places. And I said, well, geez, I don't even have 10, you know, and I've been doing this for 20 years. I don't even have 10, right? But so it's the idea of being a balance between really excited that you can and want to do these types of media things, and a bit humble and critical of your own work. Not critical to the point where it stops you from going forward, but about selecting, you know, the 3 or 4 pieces of whatever it is that you think are really, really good. That you won't think are really, really good in 6 months, 2 years, 2.5 years, right? But that right now show what you're doing. And I think that that's rewarding for ourselves, for us to capture. You know, I have the books that I've edited and written up on a shelf in my office. Some people might say that that's egotistical. I say, for me, that's motivational, because a lot of them, I've worked with a lot of great people on these projects, and a lot of people sacrificed a lot of things for these projects to come through. And same thing for the things that you're creating and that we're creating in our everyday lives. People sacrifice their money to pay for the phone. People sacrifice their time to sit down and figure out how to use a new platform. So I guess in short, pick the 2 or 3 or 4 things that really represent what you're already doing, and use that as a springboard to maybe post some stuff on LinkedIn, or to create some sort of digital repository where you can easily share with people the things that we're proud of that show growth. I mean, it would be great if I do have some photos from when I first started doing photography, and you know, but at that time there was some really sweet stuff there. One picture out of all that remains as a good photo, right? But it's important to just kind of start surrounding yourself and realize you're already doing these things, but put away the filters, you know, don't put away the CGI, because you need that, but start to see what you can do naturally if it's a visual aspect, right? The same thing with writing. If you're writing poetry, that's great, you know. If anything you're writing and reading is great, and just start keep that motivation and come and talk with us and talk with others who've done this. I mean, I wish more students would come into my office hours in person and digitally, because I'm excellent at resumes, and we all have these different perspectives. So I don't think students utilize us enough in talking about careers and talking about how to progress through their practice. And so we're a great resource. And you can, even if you're not a student or you're a citizen and a community member, just send us emails and make us work for you. We get paid by the taxpayer. And so we're here to help grow and inspire people to create.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about those two responses as well is that there's sort of these flip sides where on one hand, as Maryam discusses, this incredible level of access that you now have to everything digital. So for example, Box of Broadcast, which you can access from the UK, which just has, virtually everything that gets broadcast on British free-to-air television. It's just unbelievable. I remember spending, probably similar to you, Maryam, having to go into film archives and things like that to get materials that had maybe only been broadcast 6-12 months ago, that you couldn't, there was no digital version, you had to go somewhere to get them. I also have routinely had to explain to students in the past why you might, for example, have used a cassette to record a song off the radio, right? Because there was no MP3, right? Unless I wanted to walk down to the record shop and pay for the single, there was no way I could get that. There wasn't an internet for me to go to, right? So just that absolute wealth of information. But of course, as you point out, Ted, the flip side of that is that we might have thousands of things that we have made or produced or created in various ways. Are they the kind of media you want to put in a professional profile? Not necessarily. And like you, I also have images, things that I've taken that won, student photography contests and things like that back in the day. But now I would look at them and think, actually, maybe, I'm proud of them, but they're not things I would put, on book covers or anything like that. But still, I went through a whole process of picking from, the multiple photos that I had, maybe getting some of them developed to look at them a bit more closely, maybe using a film camera for some of them, and going through that kind of process of curation. I think with digital technology, it can be very hard to kind of have that process because you've got so much to go through. So yeah, I think that's really interesting to reflect on. And I mean, at the risk of being old fuddy-duddies who tell students about how much things have changed, I think, my perspective from this conversation and kind of more broadly is that it seems like things have changed radically with COVID, but of course you look at the last 2 years, 10 years, 20 years, and it's a profound change that's been happening all along with the amount of content and what we do with it and how much access we have. And sometimes it can be so overwhelming that you just want to sit on the couch and not look at anything because there's just so much, right? And even more so with COVID when we're all on screens. So I think we're coming towards the end here, and I want to leave a little bit of time for some questions. So I had one last kind of very open, fairly quick question that I think, again, we'll go with Maryam and then Ted on, which is really just, is there something that has you kind of excited about the future of film, in your case, Maryam, and journalism, in your case, Ted? So maybe it's a piece of media you've come across, a film, a director, a kind of development of some kind that, yeah, has you really excited about that future.
This is something that it's actually because I have had this like minor research project on the side. It hasn't gone anywhere, but I can talk about it. That I was very excited, and even more so now because it's not just Netflix anymore, and how these non-country bound streaming platforms, which now are production companies themselves, opened up their doors to non-English or non-Western language directors. And that is something that, from someone who works with Middle Eastern cinema, got me excited back in 2016 when they had their first kind of productions from the Middle East. You have a TV series coming from Egypt, you have original TV series from Israel at the same time. So that says something that is quite exciting for me. And you have these kind of original content coming that allowing kind of a world access to funding. So it can equally be criticized that might homogenize the output and outcome. I'm well aware of that as well. But at the same time, I quite like the access. And I'm very excited about the fact that you now have average viewers who might watch TV series that is produced elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And although I would criticize the fact that they're probably watching it dubbed in English, because Netflix allows you to watch it dubbed in English, but I'm sure there's plenty of people who don't like it and watch it with subtitles as well. So that is something that is exciting for me. So it's no longer the niche film lovers who would go to festivals to see non-English language, non-French language or Spanish language content. Everyone has access to it. That is what I'm excited about, the future of my career.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting, a really interesting development. Thank you so much. Okay, so Ted, in your case, journalism.
Yeah, well, I have to say I hate watching films that aren't spoken in English dubbed over. They have to be with subtitles for so many reasons, in part because my wife's Colombian, so there's a lot of Spanish, and subtitles are on all the time. In fact, they're on for British television because I can't understand a bloody word that people are saying sometimes, especially when they start getting animated. So subtitles are always on in our house, so we appreciate that. I think, you know, one of the sad parts that we've seen, not just with COVID, but with increased inequalities and violence across the world, or different types of violence, has also happened simultaneously with participatory media and platforms. And despite deep fakes and the ability to manipulate images, we now have more people maybe performing surveillance and surveillance, which might be problematic, but are still capturing people in positions of power in ways that can be spread and shared and consequenced in courts of law and in ways to protect vulnerable individuals. And I see journalism relying on that content more and more. With that comes great responsibility in how they verify that information and how they tell the stories of narratives and don't slip into stigma and stereotype. And so there are lots of new questions and challenges that are coming. But having this content of brutalities that we know have been going on forever, particularly in certain communities and to certain peoples, having that documented multiple times from multiple angles gives journalists hopefully a much better platform and ability to speak truth. Whereas before, journalists might be accused of being ideologically biased in one way or another if they were seen to be advocating against violence for a particular group. Now, when there's evidence, visual evidence with sound even, that actually can allow journalists not to be seen as advocating, but as representing the realities of our societies, with the hopes that that means we can do a better job of creating change. So I see, hopefully that will continue, and journalists will be held to account in how they deal with those things, held responsible for how they deal with those things, but that they also can use that as a way to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Ted. So I think, so at this point, we've got a kind of 5 or 10 minutes or so for questions. I'm aware that there's a little bit of a delay just in broadcasting, so it might take some time. But while we're waiting, I do have a kind of question that I was wondering about, which has come from both of your responses, and to go back to this idea at the beginning about different kinds of remote working within, maybe creative industries in this very broad sense, right? That remote working is kind of a different concept or a different beast in the creative industries as compared to more maybe traditional kind of 9-to-5 workplaces. And so I'm wondering whether or not, and again, this will we might start with Maryam if you have something to say here, but whether remote work as a broad kind of conceptual frame, right, is kind of bad for creative practice. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people I know who work in creative industries, and some of the work that I've done has often happened kind of remotely in a way, right? So people will work, your friend, your colleague, co-director who's writing scripts probably does that, maybe at their kitchen table or in their home office. A lot of the sound editing, I know a few people who have sound studios that are in the shed outside their house kind of thing. So it already happens remotely in that way. And so I wonder if that concept is almost kind of damaging for kind of film production or the elements of film production, because there is a remoteness to it already, and just what you kind of feel about that.
Well, I mean, when it comes to, like, if we think about film production as a big film productions that are happening in the industry, you're absolutely right. In fact, using the word remote for a lot of people in the industry, it's been something that they've been doing. Like, I have friends and colleagues from undergraduate years that are in, I don't know, their art department or post-production and things, and they work 3 months they go and work on set and they come back. So their home is somewhere, but work is always somewhere else. So people who are on set, they tend to be very open about this. This is a lifestyle that they know that probably 6 months out of the year, they are traveling and are elsewhere. So they call themselves working remotely because their home is somewhere and they travel to go for work. But I think the nature of what we are calling now as remote working, it's the digital collaboration. Mm-hmm. And as you say, in pre-production, writing, development, that type of digital collaboration has always existed. If you look at, like, the major script writing software that exists out there, for years they've had digital collaboration that, you can work here on your computer and your co-writer has access in their home on their laptop. So those kind of remote work collaborations have already existed as well. And again, when it comes to post-production, always existed as well, because since 2007, I live in the UK, and most of the productions I actually edited are North American because my connection is there. So I have been here and worked with people who shot the film elsewhere. So that also always has existed. But when it comes to small scale, perhaps if students are watching this, that is impacting that a bit. So the industry is quite okay with this and has been using this kind of collaboration throughout. But when it comes to, like, small productions, for example, one of my modules that is like documentary film practice or short film production and drama, there are group works that there's like 5 or 6 students come together to collaborate from A to Z to produce a film. So this kind of remote work has impacted that type of collaboration, which before they could actually sit together and do it. But again, I can see this beautifully that students have managed to navigate it really well. In fact, I keep on saying this to colleagues that our students are a lot more tech savvy than us. They know what they're doing better than us a lot of times. So that has been good. And even they've navigated time difference. I mean, I did my best to kind of put students in similar time zones in the same group, but at the same time, it happens that not everybody is in the same time zone, but they've managed to navigate it. Yeah. The filming is the one element that is the hardest one, because even when we say remote work in the industry, they travel to come to the set to film, shoot, and then they go elsewhere to finish it. So that's been the most challenging part.
And I almost feel like it does a little bit of a disservice almost to these kinds of industries to call what we do remote working, in the sense that so much creative stuff has been happening in these distant places that come together and go away again. And there's a lot to be learned from that. So I have navigated my way to the questions now. So I can see we've got a couple of questions here that I want us to go through. So sorry, Ted, you didn't get to answer that question, but we can potentially come back to it. So we've got this question here that actually I think would probably be quite good for you, Ted, given that you were saying, please come and ask me about careers. This question, it's anonymous. I'm not sure who the person is, but thank you for this question. They say, it's really interesting to hear about the social aspect of work in both film and journalism and how that's changed in the pandemic. Do the speakers think these changes are going to affect the kind of skills that grads will need to make a career? So we'll go with you, Ted.
Well, in journalism, I think the main skill that I would argue folk need to have is more along the lines of understanding the challenges of societies and the cultural navigations that people have to take, issues of power. There are skills that we teach that are practice-based, of course, and there are skills that are taught and picked up in life. I mean, I was applying for a job once that I had an offer. I didn't take the job, but it was a good job. And when I was visiting this place, I had to write a story, right, in addition to all the interviews and all the other stuff. Well, that story started to fall through, and I had to, on my own, try and figure out what the next story is, because if that one's not going to come through, I have to find something else. So I'm on the phone juggling all these different things. Now I have 2 stories because the first one picked up. So I'm doing all this stuff on deadline. And long story short, the editor said to me, look, we can always help you with your writing, but I can't teach you how to do what you just did, right? Taking a deep breath, balancing multiple things, going in and out of comfort zones, trying something new, being comfortable with risk, and maybe failing. We don't all have to be the same person. I mean, there are different personalities that we need within all of our organizations to work. You don't have to be gregarious, right? There are different. We need people who aren't, right? But I think the social skills, or how to find yourself within a group, or how to voice your concerns so that you are comfortable and feeling safe in a work. I mean, all of these different things are skill sets that I think we need to develop better amongst all of ourselves. I need to do better in some social situations, even at 40 years old, than in other social situations. And I think those are really the skills that I would argue a good journalist needs to have. The tech stuff will come along with it. The ability to have an eye, some say you either have it or you don't. You can learn it, right? All of those things that we're teaching and that you learn on the job are things that have always been there. But it's having the ability to question and have your feelings hurt a little bit sometimes, right? Because only when we kind of feel bad do we really understand that there are so many people who haven't been able to work remotely and who've still been on the front line. And I'm not talking about the well-paid members of society who are on the front line, the surgeons and so on and so forth. I'm talking about the people who still worked fast food. I'm talking about the people who still worked in some retail. The journalist needs to be able to understand where those different vantage points are in society, not just the fellows who are working like we are, remotely perhaps, but understanding who the everyday person is, I guess is a really bad way of explaining it. So it's the social skills that I think I would like to see journalists develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Ted. Yeah, I think it's one of these things that there's a traditional way of knowing about industries and learning skills, which is you have a set of things that you can do and you go out and do those. But I always say, similarly to you, that, it's being able to be critical and also being adaptable, I think, that can be really useful for students. And that might mean socially adaptable or personally adaptable, these kind of skills that might even be seen as almost like soft skills or less important skills that I think really help students, because industries change so quickly. So the things that I learned, there's no point being able to do flash animation anymore, which is what I learned as an undergraduate. That's not a very useful skill to have, right? So we are over time, but we only have one question left. So I think I might pitch this one to Maryam, if you don't mind, and then we'll finish up. So this question is, you have talked, we in this session have talked about how work has changed, but what about the content? So have we seen, reporting or film content in your case changing significantly this year? So I think you mentioned the access to different language media on Netflix, but have you seen any of the content change? I think that's quite an interesting question.
Well, if I'm answering this, the researcher in my head says we need a bit more distance from this year to actually see and be critically able to analyze the changes in content. But based on day to day, what is being flashed, kind of advertised to us, on different kind of platforms that we all have access to, it just feels that unlike that you would think that because we live in the pandemic, we might not want to see topics that are addressing the life under pandemic. But I actually think there's a lot of content that is coming out that is very kind of freshly talking about it, that I personally sometimes feel, do I really want to watch something about pandemic right now? But at the same time, this is something that maybe is going through my head, and maybe it's been a very tough year for all of us. But at the same time, I see this reflected in my students' work as well. Like, you know, there has been a tradition of certain kind of content that students produce, and we are kind of familiar with them. You know, in film, for example, you always have a group of students who are interested in kind of slasher horror films. Mm-hmm. You have students who care about a lot in recent years about the effect of the mental health issues and other kind of student life in general, if you like. And I find it that those have now translated into life under the pandemic and how this social distancing has impacted it. So if I can see kind of this kind of small kind of focus group of my own students' productions, perhaps this is something that's reflected in industry as well. But genuinely, we need a few years to kind of then come back and look at what has been produced in 2020, 2021.
Yeah, and I think I would kind of agree with that, in that you know, we know that these things take time to filter through, but I have had students, you know, as you described, often I'll have students interested in certain kinds of genres that I see year in, year out. But this year and last year as well, at the start of the pandemic, I didn't just get horror, so I get students to come up with designs for video games. So I started to see horror video games that were set in a pandemic kind of setting, which I think, you know, so we'll see. I would not be surprised if we saw a huge uptick in that kind of, you know, pandemic kind of narrative in horror, in other sort of genres, just coming in ways that might seem, you know, quite unrelated in the next kind of 5, 10, maybe even 20 years. We'll see that come through. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, Maryam and Ted. That was a really great conversation. I would love to have gone on for much, much longer, but of course we simply don't have the luxury of time. We have to kind of finish it up at some point. But thank you so much for that. If you're interested, we do have other seminars, webinars coming up. If you're interested in our department, there's more information here. So yes, but thank you again. And I'm just going to end the session now, but thank you also to our audience who came along, or, you know, maybe we'll be watching this in some future time, I'm not sure. And hopefully you learnt a lot about the future of film and journalism.